It's the second day of cross-examination in a case questioning if COVID-19 public health measures infringed on individual rights and the Canadian Charter. At the center of it all, Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Deena Hinshaw.
And here we are in April of 2022, so about 15 months later, finally, we have the Chief Medical Officer of Alberta, Dr. Deena Hinshaw, having to answer questions under oath in court.
Adam Soos here for Rebel News. And throughout COVID-19 restrictions, we saw charter-enshrined rights and freedoms and criminal code-enshrined rights and freedoms basically evaporate with restrictions implemented by unelected health officials and politicians alike. Lots of those politicians were simply unwilling or unable or too busy or whatever justification they might give to even answer for their policies that were damaging society, damaging economies, damaging the public health, the mental health of individuals within society, very often arbitrarily when they were challenged to appear in court and justify it. They skirted those responsibilities entirely. Well, now, Deena Hinshaw, the Chief Medical Health Officer of Alberta, is actually on the stand and answering for these restrictions. And the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms is the organization that really has put her there ultimately and is asking her questions. Can you first talk about, just to set up for folks out there who maybe haven't been following this story too closely, is it fair to say that the sort of safeguards in place within society, the mechanisms like the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, have failed in safeguarding politicians from overreaching and violating those rights that we have as Canadians?
More failure than success in the past 2 years. A big part of that is that we do not have enough courts, we do not have enough judges. And so we saw in the United States where the courts were issuing rulings about the violation of their constitutional freedoms by health orders. And they got rulings in weeks, sometimes in months. And here in Canada, you take this case in Alberta, we filed the court papers in December of 2020. So after our rights and freedoms had already been violated for more than 8 months. So we waited that long just to kind of see what would happen, because if you go into court too soon, the court might say, well, just out of an abundance of caution, whatever. Anyway, but go figure, we filed in December of 2020, and here we are in April of 2022. So about 15 months later, finally, we have the Chief Medical Officer of Alberta, Dr. Deena Hinshaw, having to answer questions under oath in court. That's a year and 5 months. Now, that's not the fault of, well, it's partially the fault of Deena Hinshaw. She was supposed to have been cross-examined in September of 2020, so that would have been about 8 months after court papers were filed. And then her government lawyers said, oh, Deena Hinshaw can't possibly answer questions in court because she's so busy saving lives, and now we're in the middle of the fourth wave. She cannot possibly take 3 days away from work to answer questions. And then lo and behold, she went on holidays during the 3 days that she was supposed to have been in court answering questions. So that was from September to April. So that caused a further government delay by 8 months.
Obviously, this is something of an unprecedented thing. The Emergencies Act or the War Measures Act, very limited applications. The previous sort of applications, there were abuses involved in those cases as well, but they were under far more dire circumstances. Why is there this legal atmosphere where politicians, unelected health bureaucrats, feel that they can simply violate the rights and they don't have to justify it? Even when we spoke some time ago, you were saying, okay, well, there is sort of constitutional grounds for a couple weeks or extreme measures to suspend some charter rights. But that's not what's happening here. We're talking about years without any accountability.
Well, the dictator's playbook, it's the same tactics. People that are human rights violators, they need an enemy, they need an excuse. So the communists said the excuse, we're going to protect you from capitalism and capitalist exploitation. So we're going to take away your freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right of parents to raise and educate their own children. All your rights and freedoms, we're taking those away for your own good to protect you from capitalists. And then you get Adolf Hitler in Germany saying, well, I'm going to take away your rights and freedoms to protect you from those nasty, dangerous communists and Jews. You've got people, you had the Patriot Act and expanded government surveillance powers after 9/11, and the politicians said, well, we got to protect you from these scary terrorists, so we're going to take away some of your privacy rights. And now we've got the virus. Oh, we got to protect you from the virus, so we're going to take away your rights and freedoms. Why? For your own good, for your safety, to protect you. So it's the same theme. Governments never take away your rights and freedoms without offering something that sounds good superficially. All of these things, or most of them sound good superficially. Yeah. But when you get beneath the surface, you don't need to violate rights and freedoms to protect people from the excess of capitalism or the communists or the terrorists or the virus or anything else. You can actually deal with threats and still have a free society.
And that's exactly what these mechanisms are meant to do that were ignored. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Criminal Code, all these things that were simply set aside. But despite the delays, despite everything, we now have the Chief Medical Officer of Health for Alberta on the stand. Can you tell us, of course, for those out there who've been following, Sheila Gunn-Reid has been tirelessly tweeting all of it. I think it amounted to 4 days already, and they're on a bit of a pause, correct? And then they're going to be gathering. But if you could tell us maybe some of the highlights and some of the questions many Albertans, many Canadians are no doubt asking that she was forced to answer under oath on the stand.
Well, she has admitted that there were harmful effects to lockdowns. I don't think she had much of a choice. But then has exposed herself as very evasive and ill-informed about lockdown harms, because when it gets to the specifics, she's not that well versed on what are the specific harms to specific people in specific ways. And she kind of says, she brushes that off and says, well, there's other government departments that were looking at that. So she only admits to the harms of lockdowns in a very generalized fashion, and then she keeps on going back to the big picture, and kind of, the government propaganda message that somehow these violations of our charter rights and freedoms have saved a lot of lives. But when she's pressed on the details there, it's all speculation. I mean, that's very clear that when Deena Hinshaw is being cross-examined, she doesn't really know much about these measures, but believes very fervently that they were very good.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, and this is a bit of an aside, but we're seeing even with some of the arbitrary enforcement of injunctions with protests in downtown Calgary, the police are citing the injunction, but they don't actually know the injunction. They don't have the facts straight. When Jason Kenney or Deena Hinshaw are pressed on some of the research that should have been done to justify lockdown measures, things like this that have detrimental impacts, they seem to just not have the facts lined up. It's extremely troubling, because if anyone should have that information after 2 years, this isn't a brand new incident, readily available, it should be the chief medical officer of a province. She seems like the person who should be the authority on this. Were there any sort of bombshells or sort of shocking developments over the course of these proceedings?
Well, it was quite interesting on Thursday, on the fourth day, when Deena Hinshaw was pressed on, were these your orders or were these the cabinet orders? And she kept on saying, well, I gave advice to cabinet, and then cabinet issued the orders. But very evasive, and it's a question that we've been asking ourselves here at the Justice Centre, and a lot of Albertans have been, wondering, I mean, are we talking about Premier Deena Hinshaw and her lovely assistant Jason, or is it actually Premier Kenney who's in charge? And then on Thursday, the Alberta government said that Deena Hinshaw should not have to answer any questions about whether it was Deena Hinshaw recommending minimal violations of our charter rights and freedoms, and cabinet saying, oh, no, we want much worse violations of charter rights and freedoms, or vice versa, that it was Deena Hinshaw came out both guns blazing, wanting severe violations of rights and freedoms, and the cabinet going, oh, no, we're going to have lesser violations. And so the government's actually said that that's not the public's business, and they've claimed cabinet confidentiality. And I don't think that's right. Yeah. There should be some cabinet confidentiality about the internal discussions of cabinet. But here, if we're talking about whose orders, was this Premier Hinshaw running Alberta, or was it Premier Kenney who was in charge? This is something the public has a right to know.
Well, and yeah, of course, the back and forth, we think we should do this, those conversations, that's understandable under confidentiality. But the general sentiment of who is advocating for this more primarily, and I'm sure it's going to go the other way around when Kenny is eventually pressed on this, that he's going to say, we're not going to discuss that. It's pretty standard politicking, so that no one ultimately catches the blame when all is said and done. They say, another committee looked into that, or the cabinet looked into that. No one wants to take accountability for these policies, which someone inevitably is going to have to. For folks out there that are saying it's great that she's on the stand, that questions are finally being answered, is there sort of like a potential outcome from this? Is there a consequence? Is there, because many people might say, it's too little too late, the restrictions have been evaporated. Is it so that if they come back in the future, there's some of these safeguards are in place? What can be a positive outcome or a tangible outcome from these proceedings?
We seek a court declaration that the violation of our charter rights and freedoms was not justified, was not based on science, it was not based on requisite evidence. We had a situation with government misinformation, disinformation, politicians telling us that this would be like the Spanish flu of 1918, when within a month or two of the lockdown starting, it was evident to everybody this is not the Spanish flu of 1918. This is not the deadly killer that Neil Ferguson of Imperial College warned, and yet we had Jason Kenney still publicly comparing COVID to the Spanish flu of 1918. So, it was based on fear. It was a brand new experiment. We never have lockdowns of the entire population before in human history. And so our argument that we hope that the court will accept is that these violations of our freedom of association, freedom of religion and conscience, freedom of peaceful assembly, the right to bodily autonomy to decide what gets injected into our bodies or not, that all of the violations of our charter rights and freedoms were not justified under the charter. And that's our hope, is to get that court declaration.
And can that ensure to help that this doesn't happen again? Let's say they attempt to jump directly into lockdowns, say come November or September, fall rolls around, they're just trying to jump back into lockdowns. Could that document then be cited as, no, you've got to justify what you're doing here?
Well, hopefully the court actions will also be a warning to governments that they need to consider whether they actually have a reasonable basis and actual evidence to justify the violation of our rights and freedoms. Unfortunately, we've got too few courts and judges. The court process is too slow. And it's been suggested to me, maybe that's not a coincidence, that if the governments had proper funding for the courts, or perhaps had a separate constitutional court that would review matters very quickly. Some countries have specific constitutional courts that only handle constitutional issues. But this is a problem, that litigation takes a long time. Mm-hmm. So you have governments violating charter rights and freedoms for months, for years, and you don't have a court ruling to hold the government to account.
And then seemingly, where in many other instances there might be sort of some sort of retribution or repayment for damages caused over those times, it seems the government is entirely exempt from that sort of repayment while fundamental rights are being stripped away from people. So there's a bit of a pause now. When will Dr. Deena Hinshaw be back on the stand? And when like you said, the courts move slowly, but when might we expect an actual resolution?
Unfortunately, the court proceedings have been delayed again, because now the judge is going to make a ruling on the extent to which Deena Hinshaw has to answer questions, yes or no, about this issue of whether it was really her orders or cabinet, or, which tail was wagging which dog, so to speak. So now we're going to wait on a court ruling on that. And the government has said that they will appeal that to the Alberta Court of Appeal. So you're going to have this, this very important court process interrupted by government delays and stalling tactics, and it's tragic.
Well, keep us posted. Let us know when you're back in court, and we're definitely going to come for an update and speak with you once we have a ruling on this. We'll follow the appeals process. This is a story that people are following closely. John Carpay, president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, I want to thank you so much for providing us with this update. It's great to talk directly to the man himself. And thanks for everything you do for holding these government officials accountable. It's very important work. For everyone out there, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. It's certainly comforting to know that the Just Center for Constitutional Freedoms is hard at work challenging these un-Canadian and unconstitutional infringements on our fundamental and enshrined rights in this country. They aren't the only ones fighting back in the courts. However, the Democracy Fund, through your donations at fightvaccinepassports.com, is also launching legal challenges against these vaccine mandates and taking a stand in defense of our fundamental freedoms as Canadians. If you want to make a tax receipt eligible donation to those efforts, you can do so at fightvaccinepassports.com.